In the 1950s, science fiction movies warned us about giant monsters, alien invasions, and flying saucers. But three forgotten films tried something very different. They imagined the future of atomic power, space travel, computers, automation, even robots that could turn against us. It's a forgotten sci-fi trilogy that tried to show us what the future might actually look like. Did it succeed? Let's find out. Fantasy, sci-fi, horror, Rerun Zone. To see how these three movies are connected, we have to start with the producer, a man named Ivan Tors. Tors had a different idea about science fiction. Instead of focusing on alien invasions and giant radioactive monsters, he wanted to build stories around science itself and the people trying to understand it. So he created a fictional government agency called the Office of Scientific Investigation, or OSI for short. It's like a scientific detective agency. When something strange happened involving atomic energy, radiation, or some new technology, these people were called in to figure out what was going on. Between the years 1953 and 1954, Tors built three movies around that concept. The Magnetic Monster came first, then Raiders to the Stars, and finally, Gog. They weren't sequels in the traditional sense. You didn't have to watch one to understand the others. What connected them was the OSI and the idea behind it. Scientists investigating problems that might someday become real. And the first movie gave them a pretty big problem to solve, because in The Magnetic Monster, the monster isn't a giant insect or some creature from outer space. The Magnetic Monster came out in 1953, and right away Ivan Tors did something unusual. There's no spaceship, giant insect, or guy in a rubber suit knocking over miniature buildings. Instead, the trouble starts when electrical equipment begins acting strange, and large amounts of power suddenly disappear. That brings in the OSI. Investigators Jeffrey Stewart and Dan Forbes eventually traced the problem to an artificial radioactive isotope that was created in a lab. And this thing has one very bad habit. It feeds on energy. Every time it absorbs energy, it grows. Then it starts releasing a huge burst of radiation and starts the process all over again. Apparently, it's always hungry. The OSI quickly realizes they have another huge problem. The isotope keeps doubling in size, and if they can't stop it, eventually it could threaten the whole planet. They even try to explain the science behind all of this. There are isotopes, magnetic fields, radiation, energy absorption. The film takes all of that completely seriously. Underneath all the 1950s pseudoscience is actually a pretty interesting idea. Remember, this was 1953. The atomic bomb was still a very recent memory, and nuclear technology was advancing quickly. Most people had very little idea where all of this was going. So, the real monster in the Magnetic Monster isn't the isotope. It's the possibility that scientists could create something they don't know how to control. And today, that idea doesn't seem quite too far-fetched. Eventually, the OSI comes up with a plan to destroy it, and without giving away everything that happens, let's just say they come up with a very creative solution. So, did the Magnetic Monster predict the future? Well, we never had to save the world from a radioactive isotope with an eating problem before, but the idea that technology might advance faster than our ability to control it? Ivan Tors may have been on to something there. Riders to the Stars arrived in 1954, 3 years before Sputnik, and 7 years before Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space. So when this movie was made, no one really knew what sending people into space was going to look like. The problem this time is meteors. Scientists believe that cosmic radiation may be weakening the metals they would need to build spacecraft. But meteors have been traveling through space for millions of years without falling apart. So the solution seems obvious. Send some guys into space and grab one. And if you're thinking that sounds easier said than done, you'd be right. Before anyone gets near a rocket, the government secretly selects a group of scientists and puts them through a series of physical and psychological tests to find the best men suited for the mission. This part of the movie is very interesting because Tors understood something that would become very important during the real space program. Being smart wasn't enough. An astronaut had to stay calm under pressure, make quick decisions, and function in an environment where one mistake could kill him. Eventually, they narrow the group down and prepare 3 rockets for the mission. Here's where Riders to the Stars becomes a mixture of ideas that were surprisingly forward-thinking, and ideas that remind you that this movie was made in 1954. For one thing, these astronauts aren't exactly floating around the cabin like we later watched the Apollo astronauts do. Then there's the actual meteor catching operation. I have to give the movie credit though. Trying to intercept a tiny object traveling through space at tremendous speed is a great way to create tension. It's also the first indication that maybe somebody should have thought this plan through a little more carefully. The mission becomes dangerous very quickly, and the movie doesn't treat space as some peaceful place where astronauts casually float around admiring the view. Space is hostile. Radiation is dangerous. Equipment can fail and people can die. Now, did Tors get everything right? Not really. Some of the science requires a very generous suspension of disbelief. That's not really what interests me about these movies, though. It's what Tors was thinking about. In 1954, he was already asking what prolonged exposure to space might do to people and equipment. He understood that radiation would be a problem. He understood that astronauts would need extensive physical and psychological screening. And he understood that spaceflight wasn't just going to be about building a powerful enough rocket. We'd actually have to learn how to survive once we got up there. And only a few years later, those weren't science fiction questions anymore. They were problems NASA actually had to solve. So, did Riders to the Stars predict the future? Well, not the part about chasing meteors around in spaceships, but the larger idea that space would present dangers we couldn't fully understand until we actually went there. That one was pretty close. And after taking us inside the atom and then sending us into space, Ivan Tors had one movie idea left. For the final OSI movie, Ivan Tors brought us back to Earth, but this time, the future had arrived. Most of GOG takes place inside a huge underground research facility where scientists are working on everything from nuclear power to space technology. Much of the facility is automated, and at the center of it all is a massive computer called Novak, which controls many of the systems throughout the lab. Connected to it are 2 robots named Gog and Magog, and if you're going to build 2 powerful robots and name them Gog and Magog, maybe you shouldn't give them access to everything in the building. Sure enough, things start to happen. The equipment starts malfunctioning. Scientists are killed in what first looked like accidents, and OSI investigator David Shepard is sent in to figure out what's going on. Once again, Tors treats the whole thing like a scientific detective story, except this time, the list of suspects includes a computer and 2 robots. It's 1954, and most people had never seen a computer in person. It wasn't something sitting on your desk or tucked inside your pocket. These were enormous machines to fill rooms, and were mostly associated with government agencies, universities, and the military. Yet here was a movie that imagined a facility where one central computer could monitor and control equipment throughout the building. The basic idea of connecting more and more systems to a central computer feels surprisingly familiar today, but it wasn't back in 1954. And then there are Gog and Magog. These aren't sleek robots. They're big, bulky machines with mechanical arms, flashing lights, and looking like somebody built them out of leftover parts from Radio Shack. These robots are machines designed to perform tasks for humans, and when control of those machines falls into the wrong hands, well, the technology that was supposed to make the facility safer and more efficient suddenly becomes dangerous. Now we're getting close to the world we live in today. Think about how much of our world now depends on interconnected computers. Our homes, our cars, our businesses, our power systems, our communications, even the devices we carry around in our pockets all day. The more things we connect and automate, the more convenient our life becomes and the more dependent we become on the machines. There's also another question. What happens if somebody else gains control of those systems? That's the real fear underneath GOG. The movie doesn't portray technology itself as evil. The computer is just a tool. The robots are just tools. The danger comes from someone being able to use that technology against the people who created it. For 1954, that's a pretty interesting idea. Of course, GOG is still very much a 1950s sci-fi movie. The science is a little questionable. The robots move at roughly the speed of somebody pushing a refrigerator across the kitchen. And there are moments when you wonder why the scientists in this advanced underground lab never considered installing an emergency off switch. But there's something about how seriously the movie takes all of this. Torres wasn't trying to scare us with creatures from another planet. He was asking whether the technology we were building might someday create dangers of its own. Computers controlling other machines? Automation replacing jobs people once performed? Remote access to critical systems? Machines doing more and more of the work while humans depend on them? Those aren't science fiction ideas anymore. So did GOG predict the future? Not exactly. We're still waiting for Gog and Magog. But of the 3 movies in Ivan Torres' OSI trilogy, this may be the one that comes closest to recognizing where technology is eventually taking us. When you put these 3 little films together, you start to realize that Ivan Torres wasn't predicting futuristic gadgets. He was predicting futuristic problems. So, did these movies actually predict the future? The answer to this question is yes and no. We never had to fight an energy-eating isotope, and NASA never sent astronauts into space to chase meteors. And as far as I know, nobody's been attacked by robots yet. But Torres was asking questions that turned out to be surprisingly relevant. What happens when we create technology we can't completely control? How do we protect people and equipment in space? What happens when we become dependent on computers and automation? Those questions aren't science fiction today. That's what's so interesting about these 3 movies. Ivan Torres was looking at the science of his own time and asking a simple question. Where is all of this taking us? And maybe that's why these 3 movies deserve another look. They're not just 3 forgotten sci-fi movies from the 50s. They're 3 little snapshots of what people once thought our future might become. And now that we're living in that future, it's interesting to see just how close they came. So what do you think? Which of these movies came closest to predicting the future? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you like rediscovering forgotten science fiction like this, stick around, become a channel member. This is Rich from Rerun Zone. Thanks for watching, and have a good night.